Should we get started? Am I on? All right, we're going to get started. Dan, can you hear me?
Yeah, hey, thanks.
Awesome. Okay, so we have a very special sit-down today. Dan Morehead from Pantera Capital has joined us. We're going to do 20 minutes of Q&A, some questions that we've prepared that we think would be really insightful. To hear Dan's kind of insight on these areas, and then we'll go into a 10 minutes of open Q&A. So a little bit of context on Dan as well. I'm really excited about this one. Dan was actually the first person outside of our advisory group or KIC to actually hear about the project. When we announced at Token Summit on May 25th, we flew down to New York the day before to do press meetings with everyone who was going to be writing about the story. And Dan actually came into our office at 8 a.m. before anyone else did. Very little context. Was the first to hear kind of the vision of the story, and we're really excited about the fact that Dan has been extremely supportive through this whole process. He is an investor in our pre-sale, but beyond that, him and his team have been extremely supportive in helping us think about the project, connecting us to other helpful people in the space, and all around has just been extremely supportive. We definitely would not be where we are without Dan and his team at Pantera. So really excited to welcome him today. So Dan, we were trying to get the video going, but unfortunately we had some technical difficulties. So we get to look at this picture of Dan on the cover of Traders Magazine. I can confirm he looks that good in person. I guess we'll just get started. Dan, if you want to just give us a little bit of your background, just for a little bit of context.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So the first half of my career was trading global macro-style hedge funds, so investing in currencies and equities and commodities and things around the world and big picture style stuff. That was really my day job, but my passion was always investing in disruptions, like in the 90s, Glasnost in Russia and privatization there, or Middle Eastern equities, or Argentine farmland, or Tesla Motors, or things that were going to disrupt something. And in 2011, I was introduced to Bitcoin and came to realize, it took a year or two to figure this out, but that it would be orders of magnitude more disruptive than all the rest of those trades. And so we decided to reorient our firm exclusively to blockchain and launched the first cryptocurrency fund in the U.S. and then I think launched the first venture fund that was exclusively focused on blockchain. And then we did launch the first ICO fund, which Ken is one of the positions.
Yeah, so what would you say, I know you kind of mentioned that you see that decentralized business models and cryptocurrency are one of the most disruptive things that you've seen in the past couple of decades. What are the things that really excite you the most about how those are being used and what that might look like going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it actually is a seminal moment in finance that KIC is the first essentially real company to tokenize all the other tokens, and now apparently there's 1,000 different tokens. Supposedly 400 came out last month alone. All the rest of those are essentially a white paper and a couple of people, and no product, no community, really nothing real yet. Where the Ken ecosystem is, as you know, 150 people building stuff for 9 years that actually exists. You have 15 million frequent users. You have hundreds of millions of people that could be users if you sprinkled a little bit of cryptocurrency on them. So that's why I think it's really exciting, because it's the only or the first real project with a real community that is tokenized.
Got it. Yeah. And how would you say you and Pantera evaluate projects? Obviously, you kind of alluded to how you guys were looking at Ken and what we've been doing, but understanding that you have a pretty broad portfolio, what are the things that kind of get you excited about things in the space, and how do you guys evaluate those projects?
Well, there's a notion these days that a token is just another thing in the capital structure quiver that you can use. You got debt, you got equity, you got a token, and I really think people are missing the fact that cooperatively owned protocol tokens are really antithetical to equity, where you're trying to extract value out of your consumer or your customer. And you guys know very well that in the social space, it is the user that's actually the producer. They're building the content. They're making the value in the system. And so, to be charging them or trying to advertise to them or trying to exploit them somehow, is really kind of goes against the grain of the spirit of the thing in the long run. And it's worked great for 10 years. That's totally fine. But I think in the next 10 years, it'll be these cooperatively owned protocols that actually are the ones that people want to invest their time in and want to further, because they'll ultimately own a chunk of the community rather than essentially being exploited by the owner of the community.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's kind of an important point that Dan kind of mentioned there, was the collaborative nature of kind of the cryptocurrency space, and that it turns these business models from extracting value to a cooperative where everyone's trying to working together to make the ecosystem worth more. I would be interested to hear kind of what other verticals you find interesting in the decentralized business models, as well as people that are applying a cryptocurrency and a token to their model. We've talked a lot about the consumer application level that Ken is working on, but I think there's a lot of other interesting ones like identity, storage, and things like that we'd love to kind of hear your point of view on.
Sure. So, there are some verticals that decentralized applications incredibly powerful, and then there are others that it's terrible. It's a bad idea. And so, we've focused on the ones where the token itself has incredible utility and a decentralized format is way better than a centralized one. And one of the main ones is where there are, two or more entities that are trying to interact that don't really need a centralized counterparty, and exchanges are a great example. We've grown up with centralized exchanges that have an enormous amount of counterparty risk, enormous amount of credit risk, but you can build decentralized exchanges where people are essentially posting their collateral to a blockchain, and when the trade matches, that it pays out to the other side, so you don't need to have a centralized counterparty. There are things like Tanner alluded to, like file storage is a great one, where most people just buy a computer with like 10 times the amount of storage they actually need, and they have a lot of extra space they could lease out. And so there are projects like Filecoin that are essentially like the Airbnb of your hardware, where you can rent out the extra space on there. But then there are things where you're essentially doing something that was not yet either technically possible or legally possible, and online casino gaming is a great example. Most countries have some fairly puritanical laws about like how you can gamble and in what venues and who can do it, and it's often that you can only do it in person, but you can't do it online. You can only do it in a certain city like Atlantic City, but you can't do it in the rest of New Jersey, all those kinds of rules. But there's always exceptions for peer-to-peer. They're not going to kick your door in if you're having a poker game in your house and arrest everyone. So there's a project called Funfair that developed an online casino gaming system that essentially reverse engineered all the criteria to be decriminalized gambling, and allows, using Ethereum blockchain, you can essentially post your collateral to the blockchain, and there's a smart contract, as it's called. But I mean, it's really just super simple coding of, hey, if the roulette wheel stops at 00, you pay this guy 36 times his money, and if it doesn't stop at 00, you pay the other guy. And that is going to allow applications that just literally aren't possible before peer-to-peer smart contracts were available.
Got it. Yeah, and I think Dan hit on a really interesting point there around kind of the power of blockchain and some of these decentralized models where we often think about peer-to-peer in the context of just exchanging a currency, but there's some really interesting projects like Dan alluded to, a Filecoin, where there's often areas of scarce resources and then some people have a surplus, so file storage would be one of those, and what Filecoin is doing for context is some people that have excess storage on their devices can put that up on the blockchain, and people can then encrypt their files, store it on another device, and kind of spread the wealth in terms of file storage, and you kind of take out the trusted intermediary as well. So I think there's a lot of really interesting things about peer-to-peer outside of just the context of currency, which I think Dan did a great job of kind of alluding to there. Dan, why would you say people are...
I was going to say another vertical is essentially fractionalizing or tokenizing assets that are fairly illiquid in the current market. And a great example of that would be art. Christie's and Sotheby's have a duopoly on the art market. They charge exorbitant fees, 12 to 20% on each side of the transaction, which is just crazy how high that frictional cost is. So it's very expensive to transact art, and then frankly, 99.9% of people don't have access to buying, a Jackson Pollock painting or one of these massively highly valued things. But they would want to have some exposure to it. So there are some tokenized projects, like one called Mycenas, that allow, either single pieces of art or portfolios of art to be custodied in a safe vault situation and then tokenized and split out to potentially thousands of people that want to own, a fraction of that piece of art or that portfolio of art. And then the token itself is highly liquid. So instead of, paying, 24 to 40% commission every time you transact it, you're going to pay a fraction of 1% to buy and sell fractions of that portfolio of art.
Yeah, it's definitely another interesting example. And I think, we've touched on a few of these applications of decentralized business models that probably people weren't thinking about 6 months, a year, 2 years ago. Where do you think we are in terms of maturity of the ecosystem, kind of on the growth curve of us starting to realize all the power that some of these models can kind of drive?
It's a super important question, and people have different views, and you have some people like Ray Dalio of Bridgewater who say it's a bubble, it's already way past its utility. I actually think we're really at the beginning of a multi-decade transition, and as I said at the beginning, Kin is the first kind of real company, first one with a product and a community to tokenize. So, there's potentially thousands of other companies that would want to do that. So I think we're really, really at, the absolute beginning of this process. And it, like the rest of the internet, it took decades to roll out. So this isn't going to happen overnight, and there's going to be some some projects that work really well. There's going to be a lot of, pets.coms of cryptocurrency. So it's not going to be totally perfect, but I think we're, absolutely, in the first innings of a very, very long process.
And what do you think is going to drive kind of mainstream adoption of these types of, both on the business model side, where people are starting to invest more time and resources in building in the space, but also consumers getting to actually engage with some of these models?
Yeah, I think it just takes people a while to kind of get their head around this. It's such a fundamental change in the way value is transferred that you don't need a third party taking a cut out of every transaction. And then, unfortunately, the analogs people use for these new protocols are somewhat misleading. And to call blockchains cryptocurrencies, I think, has been a bit of a disservice, that it gets people, to kind of get really heated about it. And, currencies are really one of the only faith-based systems on Earth. And there's a lot of people that are super resistant to, Bitcoin or other blockchains being currencies because, hey, the Canadian dollar, the U.S. dollar, those have been pretty good. I mean, they've lost 90% of their value since the 1950s, but most Americans or Canadians don't really think about that, and they kind of, it's kind of a slow drip, so they don't really notice it. So they've been kind of inured to the debasement of their currency. But I think if people, actually start using a cryptocurrency, they instantaneously get really excited about it, and that's what I think's perfect about Kick strategies, to distribute a little bit of this cryptocurrency to initially their power users, and then ultimately, all of their users. Because once somebody has something and they use it, they realize how, fun and exciting it is, and actually useful, like, being able to transfer money around the world. So I think that's really it. You got to get this in people's hands. And up until this point, all the other protocol tokens in the space have been just a white paper. So, like, you can't actually use it. But the fact that you guys are rolling out product, that's going to really excite people.
So this time last year, I don't think anyone could have truly predicted what the year 2017 was going to bring in this space. But you guys have kind of been at the forefront of thinking here. Do you have any predictions for 2018?
No, that's a great question. This space is just always like a Cambrian explosion of such cool ideas. And I actually do remember, meeting you and the rest of the team at Kick, when one of the founders of Ethereum, told me about this project and said, I should get in touch. And, I came down and you guys told me what you're doing, and it just blew my mind. It was really cool because, again, it's the first real company to actually do this. And we've seen probably 600 other projects. And, a lot of them are going to be really impactful and they're really interesting, but they're all very theoretical. They're just a white paper and, literally no code written, nothing else happening. So I'd really, really be humble to actually predict what's going to happen in a year, because so much, basically, ERC20 tokens and all this really amazing development is less than a year old. It really started less than a year ago. So it'd be hard to predict, but I actually think there's going to be a lot of companies that follow your path and essentially tokenize and go, all into this space. And I think the next 12 months is going to be fascinating.
Awesome. So you guys just raised your new fund. You brought on Joey to do some co-investing. What's the big focus for 2018, given kind of that broad brush prediction that you just gave?
Yeah, so we are looking at a lot of different verticals. I think some obvious ones, like here, I'll just throw one out. I think a really obvious one would be a decentralized Airbnb. So cryptocurrencies are really good for doing, high value, low frequency trades. Obviously, Visa is better at doing 15,000 transactions a second. Bitcoin and Ethereum can only do 5 or 6. So you're going to see applications like Airbnb, which is something people don't use like every hour. They use it, a couple times a month or a couple times a year, but they're very high value transactions, and they're typically cross-border, so you have a foreign currency translation component. So we're looking at a handful of projects that are trying to do a decentralized Airbnb type model. Obviously, decentralized gaming, poker, amazing use cases. And just to give a sense of, kind of the opportunity here, we were the largest investor in a project called Funfair, and it does what would be legal casino gaming online, and the entire value of the project is $75 million. And, you don't really need to be a finance genius to think, if you buy into something that's legal online gaming at $75 million, that's probably a good trade, right? The gaming industry, tens of billions. And so, hey, yeah, there's certainly risk here, but you're buying in at such an early stage in the development that you probably have a pretty good risk-reward ratio.
Got it. I appreciate that. And I think we wanted to open up to open Q&A now. I'm not sure if anyone in Waterloo wants to start, or New York. Graham has a question, our sound engineer.
Hey. Are there, in your opinion, any greater risks to cryptocurrency usage in general than government regulation?
Oh, sure. I think we're now past the, kind of the point where blockchain is out there in the wild, and it's going to be hard to put it back. So I think in 10 years, a blockchain will be really important. There are some risks to the particular blockchains, like, obviously Bitcoin's the first one to make it all work, but there's some governance issues. Bitcoin has a really, really nice problem in that it's growing so quickly that the number of transactions is now hitting what is essentially arbitrary cap on the number of transactions per second. So they're experiencing some governance issues, which is causing these incompatible software upgrades, aka hard forks, to happen. I think each particular blockchain could have issues, but I think the industry as a whole is kind of reached escape velocity, and it's going to be strong. To your question, Graham, about regulation, I would say that most countries have been absolutely neutral about blockchain. They don't really do anything to help blockchain, and they don't really do anything to hurt it. There are a few countries like China that are manipulating blockchain, I think, purely for a strategic economic advantage that they're looking for. And there's a few countries like Luxembourg or Switzerland that are being very progressive in trying to promote blockchain. And we've even had the head of state of Luxembourg visit our office a couple times over the last 3 years to figure out how to make their country, more accessible for blockchain projects and how to do ICO legislation. But in the United States, most of the agencies that can ruled a long time ago, like the CFTC, ruled many years ago that cryptocurrency was a commodity. And so you have had some small exchanges doing cryptocurrency futures in the past. But a few weeks ago, there's a very important announcement where the Chicago Mercantile Exchange has announced they're going to launch Bitcoin futures on December 15th. So that's going to be absolutely enormous validation for the industry and bring a lot of traditional investors in. And then the last agency to rule is the SEC. And cryptocurrency has a lot of the attributes of being a security, but it doesn't have a regulated custodian that custodies any Bitcoin yet. And so it actually technically can't be a security. So I think the SEC has been wise in allowing the market to develop without ruling either way, whether Bitcoin is or, importantly, is not a security. And so that's a risk. Obviously, we could wake up tomorrow and find out the SEC's made some really draconian ruling, but I think it's, so far, at least the last 8 years, all the U.S. regulators have been, fairly neutral.
Hey, so given what you had said about the appeal of low-frequency, high-value transactions on the blockchain, and then also given what folks like Don Tapscott are constantly citing as an appealing use case of the blockchain, that being real estate and the putting of deeds and rights to property on the blockchain. How do you view that space, and have you seen any interesting projects in that space?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have to say it's strange that it's one of the most common examples of what a distributed ledger can do is to remove property title insurance. So we've for 5 years been looking for that kind of company, and I'm actually not sure why we haven't found one, because it really does make a ton of sense that every time you refinance your mortgage or every time you transact a property, you have to pay thousands of dollars to a company to essentially guarantee that some Native American doesn't have a title to your house from 230 years ago, which we've determined once, decades ago, and so it's not obvious why you have to keep determining that that's true. So a blockchain, which is an immutable database of transactions or of titles, would be a great place to do that. So it seems like something that absolutely has to happen, and we've seen hundreds and hundreds of projects over the years. For some reason, we haven't ever come across one that does that well, but I think they will. Here's the other one that I think is an enormous use case is medical records, right? There's an enormous amount of the cost, enormous percentage of the cost of the health systems in countries is not used for palliative care for the patient itself. It's used for shuffling papers, back and forth between, the various doctors and the insurance companies and the people that reimburse the insurance companies. So there are a number of projects that are doing essentially centralized blockchain-based, medical records. That's another example, like property titles, where instead of having a bunch of intermediaries earning a lot of money for just kind of shuffling stuff around, you can have one database that's kind of a central point of record.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, just about a lot of these projects as well don't actually necessarily need a cryptocurrency. So some of these things around medical records and deeds of house, I think that's an area that makes a lot of sense for decentralized ledgers. I think we have time for one more question. I'm not sure if anyone in Waterloo or Tel Aviv, perhaps, Toronto, we haven't heard from. No? All right. Dan, do you have any last words for us, some parting remarks?
Oh, yeah, I actually just want to thank you all for your efforts. I think you really are on the cutting edge of something that when people look back in 10 or 20 years, they're going to see Kicks ICO as a seminal moment in finance, and I think it's really cool. And so I just want to thank you all for all your work. It's really exciting. And the white paper that you guys wrote collectively is absolutely fantastic, and I recommend it to everybody that's trying to figure out why, what is so important here and why are so many people getting excited about the space. I recommend that they read the Ken white paper. So thanks very much for all your efforts.
Appreciate the kind words, and on behalf of all of us, really appreciate all the support you've given us since pretty much day one, May 24th, the day before we even announced to the world. We've had one of the biggest supporters in the industry. So Dan, can't thank you enough for taking the time and all your continued support.
Oh, yes.
All right, and with that, I think we'll close Sit Down. So thanks, everyone.